When I sent a desperate message to my family group chat, emergency, need hospital ride, I expected worry, urgency, maybe even someone running out the door to help. Instead, my own sister replied with 3 cold words: call an Uber. I thought I knew my family, but what happened in the hours and days that followed would uncover truths I never imagined, shatter old loyalties, and show me who really stands by you when your life is on the line. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sharp pain started in the early hours of a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind that presses down on the rooftops and rattles the gutters. It was sudden, stabbing, and so intense I could hardly breathe. I was sitting at my kitchen table, halfway through my first cup of coffee, when it doubled me over. It wasn't like the stomach cramps I'd had before or the occasional twinge from my back. It felt deeper, more dangerous, something in my body screaming that something was terribly wrong. My phone was right there on the table, and instinctively I reached for it. My fingers trembled as I pulled up the family group chat, the one that had been buzzing with weekend plans and my cousin's vacation pictures just yesterday. Without thinking twice, I typed, "Emergency, need hospital ride." My thumb hesitated only a moment before hitting send. I expected an immediate response. Maybe my brother saying he'd grab his keys, or my parents asking what happened. Instead, seconds passed in silence. I clutched my side, trying to stay calm, staring at the little seen checkmarks next to my message. Then my sister's reply appeared. Call an Uber. 3 words. No question, no concern, no offer of help. My vision swam for a moment, a mix of shock and the pain that was steadily worsening. I wanted to believe she was joking, or maybe she didn't understand the urgency, but the more I thought about it, the more those words stung. My heart wasn't just pounding from whatever was happening inside my body, it was also from the coldness I felt from someone I'd always assumed would drop everything for me. I tried to stand, thinking maybe I could get to the door, hail a neighbor, or do exactly what she said and call for a rideshare. But my legs buckled halfway up, sending me back into the chair. My breath caught in my throat as another wave of pain tore through my abdomen. I knew I didn't have the luxury of pride right now. I opened the rideshare app, praying there would be a car close by, but the screen told me there were no drivers available in my area due to the heavy rainstorm sweeping through town. My hands began to shake harder, not just from the pain, but from the rising fear that I might actually be stuck here, alone. I sent another message to the group chat, this one shorter, more desperate. Can't move, no cars, please help. The typing bubbles appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, my mother's message popped up. Your father's at work, and I don't drive in this weather. Rest for a while, maybe it will pass. Rest for a while, I wanted to scream. I could barely sit upright. My vision was going in and out, and something deep in my gut told me that resting wasn't an option. I knew my mother meant well. She always tried to avoid panic, but this felt more than just her usual calm approach. It felt like denial, like she didn't want to accept that I might actually be in serious trouble. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows. I glanced toward my front door, thinking of the few neighbors I knew, but I couldn't imagine walking even the short distance to knock on someone's door. My phone buzzed again, this time not from the family chat, but from my friend Leah, who lived across town. She had seen my message in a smaller group we were both a part of and asked what was going on. I told her the truth in a shaky text. I think I need an ambulance. She didn't hesitate. I'll be there in 10 minutes, she wrote back. Relief flooded through me, but it was tangled with something else. A raw ache that it wasn't my own family racing to my aid, but a friend who owed me nothing. By the time Leah arrived, the pain had become unbearable. She half carried me to her car, wrapping me in her jacket because I'd been too disoriented to grab one. The drive to the hospital was a blur of flashing traffic lights and the roar of rain on the windshield. I kept trying to focus on the world outside to distract myself, but my thoughts kept circling back to my sister's message. Call an Uber. It replayed in my head like a cruel echo, stripping away layers of trust I didn't realize could be taken from me.
Long before that rainy Tuesday morning, the cracks in my family had been there. Quiet, but growing. like hairline fractures in glass that you don't notice until the light hits them just right. On the surface, we looked like an ordinary, close-knit family. There were group photos at birthdays, coordinated outfits on Christmas mornings, and the occasional Sunday dinner where we sat around my parents' dining table eating pot roast and pretending nothing was wrong. But the truth was, there had been a slow erosion over the years, an unspoken set of rules about who mattered more, who was worth helping, and who was expected to fend for themselves. I had learned to navigate those rules without calling attention to them, because pointing them out only made me seem bitter or ungrateful. My sister Rachel had always been the center of my parents' attention. Not because she asked for it, though sometimes she did, but because she had mastered the art of appearing indispensable. If there was a family decision to be made, she spoke first and loudest. If someone needed a ride, a loan, or a favor, she decided whether it happened, and my parents usually followed her lead. Over the years, I had been told, in different ways, that I was the self-sufficient one, the one who didn't need checking on, the one who would figure it out. At first, I wore that label like a badge of honor. I thought it meant they respected my independence. But as time went on, I realized it was also a convenient excuse not to offer help when I actually needed it. There had been smaller incidents before, moments that should have been red flags but instead became part of the background noise, like the time my car broke down late at night and I called the group chat for help. Rachel responded with a laughing emoji and a comment about how I should finally get roadside assistance. Or the time I was laid off from my job and asked if I could stay with my parents for a few weeks while I figured things out, and my mother told me that Rachel was going through a lot and needed the extra space more than I did. I told myself I could handle those situations, and I did. But every time, it left a faint bruise that didn't fully fade. The unspoken hierarchy in my family meant that when Rachel needed something, everyone moved quickly, rearranging their schedules to accommodate her. When I needed something, the default was to suggest I find my own solution. It was an old rhythm, one that had been playing so long we all knew the steps by heart. I suppose I had grown numb to it, accepting it as part of the family dynamic, until that morning in the kitchen when my body betrayed me, and I realized just how dangerous that pattern could be. The night before the emergency, our group chat had been full of banter. My dad had sent a photo of the neighbor's cat curled up on his truck hood, Rachel had shared a picture of her new manicure, and my mom had been talking about a local bakery she wanted to try. It wasn't a hostile environment, it was just selective. My messages were often acknowledged with a thumbs up or a short reply, while Rachel's updates drew full conversations. I hadn't thought much of it until I compared the tone of those exchanges with the way my emergency plea was handled. The sudden shift from casual chatter to indifference made the truth hard to ignore. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sitting in the hospital that day, after Leah had gotten me there, I started replaying the years in my mind. I could see now that the hidden problem wasn't just a lack of urgency in my family. It was the quiet belief that I didn't need them, that my emergencies weren't real emergencies. It was a dangerous assumption built on years of me making do without asking for much. I had trained them to believe I would always be fine, and they had trained themselves to believe that meant they didn't have to show up. When the doctor came in to explain the initial test results, I was still distracted by those thoughts. His words were clipped and serious. They suspected a ruptured appendix, possibly complicated by infection. Immediate surgery was on the table. My stomach dropped, not just from fear of what was happening physically, but from the realization that if Leah hadn't come, I might have been sitting alone in my kitchen trying to write it out while my family continued their morning routines. It was one thing to feel overlooked in matters of inconvenience. It was another to realize that indifference could have cost me my life. I didn't tell my family about the diagnosis right away. It wasn't intentional at first. I was being moved between rooms, answering nurses' questions, and signing forms. But there was also a hesitation in me, a reluctance to share something so serious with people who had already proven, hours earlier, that they didn't see my situation as urgent. I knew eventually I would have to tell them, but for the moment I let the silence sit. It was a kind of test, one I hadn't consciously decided on, but felt compelled to see through. Would they check in on their own? Would anyone reach out without me prompting them again?
The answer came in the form of my phone vibrating on the hospital tray. It was a message from Rachel in the group chat. "Did you make it to the hospital?" Her tone was flat, almost administrative, like she was confirming whether a package had been delivered. I stared at the screen for a long moment, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to fire back with the truth, to tell her I was about to be wheeled into surgery because of a ruptured organ. Another part of me didn't want to give her the satisfaction of thinking she'd done her duty just by asking. That was the moment I began to understand that this wasn't going to be a one-day problem. The emergency had ripped the curtain back, showing me what had been there all along. A family dynamic built on uneven scales, where loyalty was conditional and concern was rationed. The hidden problem wasn't about a single ride to the hospital. It was about years of being quietly placed in a category where my needs were optional. And now, with the stakes higher than they ever been, I was about to find out just how deep that division ran. The moment the surgeon walked in, I knew there was no more pretending this was something I could wait out. His face was composed, but edged with the kind of urgency that doesn't leave room for debate. He explained that my appendix had already ruptured, spilling infection into my abdominal cavity, and that every hour without intervention increased the risk of sepsis. I heard his words in fragments: perforation, contamination, risk of organ failure, but the weight of them settled heavily in my chest. There was no time to second guess. They were prepping me for surgery within the hour. I nodded, signing the necessary consent forms with hands that felt detached from my body. Somewhere beneath the adrenaline, a dark realization was taking root. If Leah hadn't driven through that rain, if she'd been busy or hadn't seen my message, I could have been lying in my kitchen dying while my own family scrolled past my words. That thought was more chilling than the prospect of the operation itself. As the nurses bustled around me, swapping my clothes for a hospital gown, securing IV lines, and checking my vitals, I kept glancing at my phone. It sat on the tray beside the bed, a lifeline to the outside world that felt strangely silent. The family group chat had gone quiet again, my earlier unanswered messages lingering there like unwelcome reminders. Rachel's last text, the flat inquiry about whether I'd made it to the hospital, was still at the top. No follow-up, no offer to come. Not even a short, "hope you're okay." My parents hadn't said anything since my mother's earlier suggestion that I rest for a while. It was as if the moment I found a way to get myself to the hospital, their obligation had ended. I wasn't sure whether to be more hurt or angry. Leah returned from the cafeteria with a paper cup of water for me, sensing I was lost in my thoughts. She stayed close, ready to help, and even managed to make me smile briefly when she joked about the unflattering hair cover the nurses would give me before wheeling me in. But her presence also made the absence of my family stand out in sharper relief. She had taken hours out of her day without hesitation, while the people who shared my blood had chosen convenience over compassion. It wasn't just the lack of help. It was the indifference, the ease with which they moved on from my crisis as though it were a minor inconvenience instead of a genuine emergency. The breaking point wasn't the diagnosis itself. It was the moment I accepted that nothing I could say or do would change how my family prioritized me. There had always been a part of me that believed if the situation was bad enough, if the stakes were high enough, they would come through. That belief was crumbling now, replaced by something harsher and more sobering. The reality was that I could be on an operating table facing life-threatening complications, and they might still choose not to get involved unless it was easy or beneficial for them. When the orderly came to wheel me toward the surgical suite, I took one last look at my phone, considering whether to send a direct message to Rachel or my parents to tell them I was going into surgery. I thought about what I might write, something short and factual, maybe even pleading. But in the end, I put the phone down. If they cared enough, they would have already been here. If they didn't, no text I sent now would change that. The decision gave me a strange kind of clarity, like closing a door I had been holding open for too long. The ride down the hospital corridor felt surreal, the fluorescent lights passing overhead in quick bursts, the wheels of the gurney humming beneath me. Everything seemed magnified, every sound, every sensation, because I couldn't stop thinking about how easily this day could have ended without anyone in my family even knowing until it was too late. It was a thought I pushed down as the anesthesia team prepared me, but it kept resurfacing in the moments before the mask was placed over my face. When I woke hours later in the recovery room, groggy and aching, the first thing I did was look toward the chair beside my bed. It was empty, save for my jacket draped over the back. Leah's bag was gone, though the nurse later told me she had been there until just recently, leaving only when she had to pick up our kids. She had promised she'd be back in the morning. My phone, now on the table, had several new notifications. I opened them with a small, almost reluctant hope, only to see that none were from my family. A few were from acquaintances who had seen Leah's post on social media asking for prayers for my surgery, but the family chat remained untouched. The reality of that hit me harder than I expected. I lay there, the monitors beeping steadily beside me, feeling the weight of the pain in my abdomen and the sting of abandonment in equal measure. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a choice they had made. To stay uninvolved, to treat my emergency as something distant and unimportant. It was the moment the illusion shattered completely. I had reached the point where I couldn't pretend we were just a little distant or a little preoccupied. The truth was right in front of me, as sharp and unflinching as the pain that had brought me here. That night in the hospital, I thought about the years I'd spent trying to be the easy one, the one who didn't cause trouble or demand too much attention. I thought about every time I'd excused their lack of involvement, every time I told myself they loved me in their own way. The breaking point was realizing that their own way might not be love in the way I needed it. It might be convenience, habit, or obligation, but it wasn't the kind of love that rushes to your side when you're in danger. That realization hurt more deeply than anything the surgeon had repaired inside me. By morning, I knew I couldn't just let this pass unspoken. The situation had crossed a line, one that couldn't be stepped back over without acknowledgement and change. What I didn't yet know was how much resistance I'd face when I finally decided to confront them, or how much deeper the truth about our family's priorities would go once the conversation started. But the decision had been made. There would be no going back to silence. By the second morning in the hospital, the sterile scent of disinfectant had become part of every breath, and the rhythmic beeping of the monitors beside me was almost like background music I no longer noticed unless it stopped. The pain from the surgery was sharp but manageable, dulled by medication, though every shift in position reminded me of the wound beneath the bandages. I had barely slept through the night, my mind restless, replaying not just the events of the past 2 days, but the years of small moments that had led to this point. The anger was still there, steady as a pulse, but something else had begun to grow alongside it. Curiosity from the people around me. Nurses, aides, even my surgeon seemed to notice the absence of family in the way their eyes lingered a beat too long when they looked at the empty chair beside my bed. It started with small comments. One nurse, while adjusting my IV, mentioned that she would have expected my room to be busier with visitors, especially after major surgery. Another, when she came to check my vitals, asked if she should put down an emergency contact since no one had been at my side during her shift. Each question was well-meaning, even gentle, but each one cut into me in a way I wasn't prepared for. It was one thing to feel abandoned in private. It was another for strangers to see it so clearly.
Their observations turned my private hurt into something visible, undeniable. Leah returned later that morning, a cup of coffee in one hand and a tote bag in the other. She had brought fresh socks, a book she thought I might like, and a blanket that smelled faintly of her home. She fussed over me for a few minutes, adjusting pillows, helping me sit up to take a sip of water, before finally sitting down and just looking at me in that way only a friend who knows you well can. She didn't ask about my family right away, but I could tell the question was in her eyes. Eventually, she glanced at my phone on the tray and asked if anyone had reached out since the surgery. I shook my head. The truth hung between us for a moment before she let out a low sigh, the kind that's more disappointment than surprise. What neither of us realized then was that she had mentioned my situation to a mutual friend the night before, and that friend in turn had told someone else. By the time visiting hours rolled around, word had quietly spread among a small circle of people I knew outside my family. A couple of them texted me asking if I needed anything. One even offered to drop off groceries at my apartment so I wouldn't have to worry about it when I was discharged. The kindness from these unexpected places made the silence from my family stand out even more sharply, like a glaring omission in a story everyone else seemed to be reading.
The surgeon stopped by midday to check on my progress. He was a brisk, efficient man, but that day he paused longer than usual after reviewing my chart. He asked if there was anyone he could update on my condition, perhaps a sibling or parent, since I might need additional support once I went home. I hesitated before telling him the truth, that my family hadn't been in contact, that no one had come by. His brows furrowed slightly, though he masked it quickly with professionalism. He explained that recovery would be slower without help, that I shouldn't be lifting heavy objects or moving too much for at least a couple of weeks. The implication was clear. I needed someone, and the person or people usually expected to fill that role were absent. By now, Leah was beginning to see the broader picture, and I could sense her frustration on my behalf. She didn't voice it outright, but she stayed longer than she had planned, ordering lunch for both of us from a nearby cafe and setting it up on the small table in my room. She made light conversation, steering me away from the bitterness that kept threatening to surface, but every so often she would glance at the door as though half expecting someone else to walk in. No one did. It wasn't just Leah and the hospital staff who noticed. The woman in the bed next to mine, recovering from hip surgery, had a steady stream of visitors, friends, children, even neighbors bringing flowers. She apologized once for the noise, but I told her it was fine. Though the truth was that each burst of laughter from her side of the curtain felt like another reminder of what was missing from mine. When one of her visitors asked if my family was coming later, I smiled faintly and said I wasn't sure. It was easier to explain that no, they probably weren't. By the end of that day, the absence had become a topic in its own right. Not because I wanted to talk about it, but because people kept circling back to it in their own ways. Gentle inquiries, sympathetic looks, offers to fill in the gap my family had left. It was as though the situation had shifted from being my private disappointment to something other people now felt invested in. Their awareness was both comforting and uncomfortable. It validated my hurt, but it also meant I couldn't brush it aside or pretend it wasn't happening. That night, as I lay awake listening to the hum of the hospital at night, I realized that having outside eyes on the situation changed everything. Before, it was just me, silently navigating the uneven loyalty of my family, telling myself stories to make sense of it. Now other people could see the imbalance. They were quietly acknowledging that something was wrong, that this wasn't normal. It made it harder for me to retreat into denial, but it also gave me a strange kind of strength. If others could see it, then maybe I wasn't imagining it. Maybe the problem really was as deep as it felt. What I didn't know then was that this quiet observation from outsiders would soon turn into direct involvement. The hospital staff's concern wasn't going to fade, and neither was Leah's determination to be there for me. That combination would eventually lead to questions my family couldn't avoid, pulling the truth into the open in a way that would make even Rachel uncomfortable. The cover of casual indifference they had relied on for years was about to start crumbling, and I wouldn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. By the third day in the hospital, the undercurrent of concern from people outside my family had shifted into something more tangible, more deliberate.
The questions from nurses became more direct, and the glances they exchanged when I answered told me they were starting to piece together the full picture. It wasn't just that my family hadn't shown up, it was that they hadn't even tried to engage meaningfully with my situation. In a place where visitors came and went constantly, where most patients had someone sitting in that small vinyl chair by the bed, my corner of the room remained conspicuously empty. That emptiness was starting to speak louder than I was. Leah had been my constant presence, juggling her own responsibilities while making sure I had everything from clean clothes to someone to talk to during the long, quiet stretches between vital checks. She'd started taking mental notes, even if she didn't say so outright. I could see it in the way her eyes lingered on my untouched phone, in how she asked every so often if anyone had messaged me yet. When I told her the group chat had been silent since Rachel's curt inquiry 2 days earlier, she didn't hide her disbelief. She started bringing it up in casual conversation with the nurses, making comments like, "It's crazy she's handling all this alone," or "You'd think her family would have call." She wasn't being subtle anymore, and I realized she was doing it intentionally, putting the truth in the open where it couldn't be ignored. The staff, too, began to keep a quiet log of their own. I overheard one nurse mentioning to another that my emergency contact information listed my parents and sister, yet neither had answered when they'd called the day of my surgery. The second nurse made a note on a clipboard, her expression tightening in a way that told me she didn't approve. I found out later that they had left voicemails with updates, but no one had returned the calls. That was the kind of detail that lodged itself in my mind, impossible to unhear.
Even small interactions began to feel like pieces of evidence. The woman in the bed next to mine asked one morning if she could borrow my charger, and as I handed it over, she glanced toward the empty chair and said, "Still no one visiting you?" She shook her head slowly, almost pityingly, before adding, "My niece lives 3 states away and still FaceTimes me twice a day." It wasn't meant to be cruel, but it reinforced what was becoming painfully clear to everyone around me. My family's absence wasn't about distance or inconvenience. It was about choice. The real turning point in this quiet accumulation came when my surgeon stopped by for his daily check-in. He asked the usual questions about my pain levels, my appetite, my ability to walk short distances without strain. Then, as he flipped through my chart, he remarked almost offhandedly, "You'll need help once you're discharged. No bending, no lifting, someone to keep an eye on you for the first few days. Do you have someone lined up?" The question hung in the air for a moment. I knew what he was really asking. Where was my family? I told him that my friend Leah was planning to stay with me for a bit, but that my family was busy. The way he looked at me, measured, almost careful, told me he didn't quite believe that explanation. Later, Leah admitted that she had taken it upon herself to talk to the nurses while I was asleep. She wanted them to know that I wasn't ignoring my family, that they simply weren't engaging. It was a small but significant shift. Until then, I'd been quietly protecting my family from outside judgment by leaving out details or softening the truth. But Leah wasn't interested in protecting their image. She was interested in making sure the people responsible for my care understood the full scope of my situation, especially since it would matter when discharge planning began. By the end of that day, I noticed subtle changes in how the staff interacted with me. They asked more often if I needed help with things like ordering meals or adjusting my bed, as though they were compensating for the lack of outside support. One nurse even offered to call a hospital social worker to help arrange short-term assistance at home. I declined at first, embarrassed by the idea of accepting help from strangers when I had a whole family just a phone call away. But the offer lingered in my mind, another reminder that the people showing up for me right now were the ones with no obligation to do so. Meanwhile, Leah began saving screenshots of the family group chat. She didn't say what she planned to do with them, but I could guess. Each one was a small timestamp of inaction. Messages from my parents about unrelated topics, Rachel posting pictures of her lunch, all while my updates about my condition sat unanswered. In any other circumstance, it might have felt petty to document those silences, but here it felt like building a case. The evidence wasn't just emotional, it was tangible, recorded in black and white. The more the evidence piled up, through conversations, observations, and digital proof, the harder it became for me to cling to old justifications. I could no longer tell myself they were too busy or didn't understand the severity of the situation. They knew. They just chose not to act. And now other people knew too. That knowledge was both a shield and a weapon. It protected me from feeling like I was imagining the neglect, and it armed me for the confrontation I knew was coming. By the time night fell, the sense that something was building was almost palpable. Leah's patience with my family was wearing thin, the staff's quiet disapproval was growing more visible, and even casual acquaintances who had heard about my situation were starting to ask pointed questions. It felt like the walls of silence my family had built around themselves were beginning to crack, not because I was breaking them down, but because others were pressing against them from the outside. I didn't know yet when or how the confrontation would happen, but I could feel it drawing closer with each new piece of evidence that slipped into place. The truth was no longer just mine to carry. It was becoming a matter of record, something that would eventually demand acknowledgement. And when that moment came, there would be no denying what had been laid bare. The shift from quiet disapproval to undeniable proof came faster than I expected, and it happened in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. On the morning of my 4th day in the hospital, the social worker assigned to my case stopped by my room. She was friendly but brisk, the kind of person who seemed to balance empathy with efficiency. She explained that because I had undergone surgery for a ruptured appendix and had a high risk of infection, the hospital was required to ensure I had proper support at home before they could discharge me. It was a standard procedure, she assured me, and usually just meant confirming that someone would be present to help with meals, medications, and light chores for at least the first few days. I nodded, thinking we would simply tell her that Leah would be there. But she insisted on calling my listed emergency contacts to verify. That was the moment I knew the truth was about to leave the private circle of my thoughts and the quiet awareness of the nurses. She pulled out her phone, confirming my sister's number first. I watched her dial and listened as the call rang. When Rachel answered, the social worker introduced herself and explained the purpose of the call. I couldn't hear every word on the other end, but I caught enough through the one-sided conversation to know exactly how it was going. The social worker repeated Rachel's words in a slightly incredulous tone. "No, you won't be available? No, you can't recommend anyone else in the family who could help? Okay, understood." She ended the call politely, but with a tightness in her voice that spoke volumes. Without missing a beat, she dialed my parents. The results were the same, though my mother's refusal was couched in softer language about bad weather and busy schedules. The social worker hung up, turned to me, and, for the first time since she'd entered, she let a flicker of her real feelings show. "I see," she said simply, her lips pressing together in a thin line. It wasn't just that my family had declined, it was the way they had done it, so quickly, so decisively, with no hesitation or attempt to offer alternatives. There was no misunderstanding to explain away, no possibility they didn't realize the importance of the request. They had been told, explicitly, by a hospital professional that I needed help to recover safely, and they had chosen not to provide it. That was the kind of evidence that couldn't be spun into something else. It wasn't my word against theirs, it was documented in the hospital's own records. The social worker excused herself to make further arrangements, promising to connect me with a short-term home health aide. When she returned later with paperwork, she explained that the hospital would cover the initial visits due to my medical need, but that ongoing support beyond that would be my responsibility. I signed the forms with a sense of detachment, my mind still caught on the fact that this had been settled so easily by my family. 4 days earlier, I might have still clung to the idea that they would step up if things became urgent enough. Now, that illusion was gone, replaced by something cold and final. Leah arrived not long after, and I told her what had happened. She didn't try to hide her anger. She sat in the chair beside my bed, her arms crossed, shaking her head slowly as I recounted both calls. She had been collecting quiet evidence over the past few days, but this was different. This wasn't just lack of presence. It was active refusal in response to a direct request from a medical professional. "They can't walk this back," she said, her voice low but certain. She was right. The staff had witnessed it. The calls were logged. This wasn't a subjective interpretation of silence. It was an undeniable fact.
Word of the calls seemed to ripple quietly among the staff. That afternoon, one of the nurses who had been particularly kind to me stopped in and asked if I needed help arranging transportation when I was discharged. I told her Leah had it covered, but I could see the look in her eyes, half pity, half disbelief that my situation had come to this. Even the woman in the bed next to me seemed to sense the change. When her daughter came to visit that evening, she gestured toward me and whispered something I couldn't hear. The daughter gave me a small, sympathetic smile before leaving. The most surreal moment came when I checked my phone later that night. Rachel had posted in the group chat, but not about me. It was a photo of her dinner, captioned with a joke about portion sizes. My parents responded with laughing emojis. My updates about my recovery, which I had forced myself to send earlier in the day, sat there unacknowledged, buried under the casual chatter. If I'd needed any further proof of their priorities, this was it, served up in real time. The emotional sting was sharp, but this time it was accompanied by a grim sense of validation. Everything Leah had been saying, everything the nurses had quietly suspected, had now been proven in a way that could not be denied. The following day would mark the beginning of my discharge planning, and with it, the arrangements for the home health aide. But it would also mark a shift in how I carried myself. I no longer felt the need to defend my family or soften the story. If someone asked where they were, I would tell them plainly. The truth had already been spoken out loud, and it had landed exactly where it needed to, in the ears of people who understood what it meant. The cover of plausible deniability was gone, and with it, the last barrier between quiet resentment and open confrontation.
After 4 days in the hospital, I had recovered enough from the surgery to sit upright without wincing sharply at every movement, and my mind, once fogged by painkillers and anxiety, had grown alarmingly clear. The clarity brought with it a single, unavoidable truth. I could no longer protect my family from the consequences of their choices. For years, I had softened the edges of their neglect, excused their absence, rationalized their indifference. But the rupture, both literal and metaphorical, had exposed the reality in such a way that it could no longer be ignored. The social worker's calls, the nurse's concerned glances, Leah's unwavering support, and even the sympathetic curiosity of strangers, all of it had combined to make the private inequity public. And in that moment, I realized that if I didn't confront my family, the story would continue exactly as it had for years, unnoticed, unchallenged, and quietly devastating. Leah had been my constant through all of this, a presence that was unwavering and unjudgmental, yet somehow fierce in the protection she offered me. That afternoon, she sat beside my bed, fidgeting with the edge of my blanket, and suggested gently that maybe it was time to set boundaries, maybe time to speak openly and clearly about what had happened. It was not a suggestion made out of anger, but out of recognition that truth had reached a point where it demanded articulation. I nodded slowly, feeling both dread and liberation tighten in my chest. I was choosing to stop hiding, to stop excusing, and to speak the truth aloud, regardless of how my family reacted. It was a choice that carried risk, yet it also offered a form of power I had never allowed myself to feel. I began drafting messages, carefully weighing each word. For years, I had believed that confrontation would lead to more conflict, more emotional damage, and perhaps even permanent estrangement. But the situation in the hospital had rewritten that calculus. Confrontation was inevitable. The only question was whether I would initiate it on my terms or continue to let it happen passively, allowing the narrative to remain in my family's control. I chose the former. The messages were concise, yet pointed, explaining the facts of the emergency, my surgery, and most importantly, the absence of support from those I had been led to believe would prioritize me. There was no embellishment, no accusation beyond what could be directly documented. The social worker's calls and hospital records served as proof I could rely on, and I included references to them without commentary, letting the evidence speak for itself.
Sending the first message directly to Rachel felt like stepping off a cliff. My finger hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity, the weight of years of muted frustration pressing against my chest. When I finally tapped it, I felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that I had finally externalized what had been festering inside me for so long. Fear of the potential storm it might provoke. Within minutes, I received her terse acknowledgement. She did not apologize. She did not express concern. She merely confirmed that she had read the message. It was the bare minimum, yet it set in motion a chain of reactions I could not yet see. Next, I reached out to my parents. Their responses were similarly minimal, concerned in tone, perhaps, but ultimately deflecting responsibility. What struck me most was not the lack of emotional depth, but the attempt to frame the situation in ways that shifted focus away from their absence. They expressed relief that I was recovering, made vague promises to check in more, and then moved the conversation to logistical questions about meals or post-surgical care. I recognized immediately that these were familiar tactics, redirecting attention, managing appearances, avoiding accountability. But now, armed with the documentation and the support of Leah and hospital staff, I did not need to accept them. I would not allow them to bury the truth under politeness or vague reassurance. The moment of no return was complete when I sent a copy of the hospital records and notes from the social worker to the family group chat. The messages were factual, time-stamped, and left no room for reinterpretation. I included Leah in the thread, not as an instigator, but as a witness to the truth, someone who had stood by me and could validate everything I said. For the first time in years, the hidden dynamics of our family were made visible in a format that could not be ignored or rationalized away. The private hierarchy, the preferential treatment, the absence of support, all of it was now on display. Immediately after sending the messages, I felt a wave of uncertainty. The waiting, the anticipation of response, or the lack thereof, was almost unbearable. I understood that confrontation of this kind would not be comfortable for anyone involved, including me. It was possible that my family would react with defensiveness, denial, or even anger. But the alternative, continuing to internalize the neglect, pretending the emergency had been handled appropriately, pretending the absence of care was excusable, was no longer viable. I had reached the point where silence would perpetuate harm, not prevent it. Leah stayed close, her presence grounding me as I navigated this uncharted emotional territory. We spoke quietly about the next steps, about managing both my recovery and the inevitable fallout. Her support was unwavering, a stark contrast to the half-hearted engagement from my family. For the first time, I understood that family wasn't defined by blood alone, but by those willing to show up when it mattered most. That realization fortified my resolve.
By nightfall, the first waves of acknowledgement began to trickle in. Not apologies, not deep admissions of fault, but confirmations that they had received the information. That alone was enough to mark the point of no return. The truth had been spoken, documented, and shared with witnesses, leaving no room for evasion. From this moment forward, the situation could no longer be ignored. It would demand reckoning, accountability, and ultimately the confrontation that had been years in the making. The confrontation began subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the hours after I had sent the detailed messages and hospital records to the family group chat. At first, it was just a series of read receipts, the tiny blue ticks signaling that my words had landed where they were intended. But soon enough, the tension escalated, palpable even across the digital divide. Rachel was the first to react, her words carefully measured, defensive in tone. She insisted that she hadn't realized the severity of my condition and that she had been preoccupied with her own commitments. Her phrasing was calculated to minimize accountability while maintaining a veneer of concern. It was infuriating the way she could acknowledge the events without ever acknowledging her failure to act. The more she typed, the more evident it became that the distance she maintained was not accidental, but deliberate. an act of prioritizing convenience over familial obligation. My parents followed shortly after, their responses a mixture of apology and rationalization. But the real confrontation came when I replied. I had spent hours preparing my response, ensuring it was firm yet factual, unflinching yet composed. I did not accuse or shame, I simply laid out the timeline, the hospital's calls, the social worker's verification, and the undeniable proof of their absence. I explained that Leah had been the only one who had acted decisively, and that while I was grateful for her support, it underscored the stark contrast with my family's inaction. As I typed, I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The relief came from finally articulating the truth, from refusing to let their evasions dominate the narrative. The apprehension came from imagining how they would respond when confronted directly with the irrefutable evidence of neglect. Their reactions were predictable, yet still jarring. Rachel attempted to deflect responsibility, citing other priorities, responsibilities she claimed she couldn't abandon, and obligations that she argued were just as urgent as my emergency. My parents tried to frame the situation as a misunderstanding, emphasizing that they were concerned, but had assumed someone else would step in, that they didn't want to interfere unnecessarily. Their words were defensive, polite yet hollow, but the evidence was unassailable. The calls from the social worker, the hospital records, Leah's consistent presence, they all contradicted the excuses. Every attempt to justify their behavior was met with an internal resistance in me that was stronger than any previous inclination to forgive without confrontation. Leah was there throughout, observing silently, occasionally offering brief clarifications to corroborate my account. Her presence shifted the dynamic entirely. Where once it had been a private confrontation with absent family members, it had become a public accountability moment. Her testimony, combined with the documented proof, eliminated any possibility of plausible deniability. My family could attempt to twist the narrative verbally, but the physical evidence of their absence, combined with Leah's eyewitness account, anchored the truth firmly in reality. By the time evening arrived, the conversation had escalated into a tense exchange, a direct conflict between the documented truth and the efforts of my family to minimize or obscure it. Each response from them seemed calculated to maintain appearances while subtly shifting blame, yet each message also reinforced the stark contrast between intention and action. It became clear that their pattern of avoidance and deflection was not merely habitual, but strategic, a defense mechanism to protect their image, rather than respond to the needs of a family member in crisis. I realized then that confrontation was not simply about making them recognize the harm caused. It was about reclaiming my own narrative, asserting the reality of my experience in the face of consistent minimization. The confrontation was emotionally exhausting. I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and incredulity at the ease with which they attempted to rationalize neglect. Yet even as the conversation unfolded, I recognized a subtle shift in the power dynamic. Whereas once it had been a private confrontation with absent family members, it had become a public accountability moment. Her testimony, combined with the documented proof, eliminated any possibility of plausible deniability. My family could attempt to twist the narrative verbally, but the physical evidence of their absence, combined with Leah's eyewitness account, anchored the truth firmly in reality. It was also a lesson in endurance. Each message required careful thought, balancing the need for clarity with the desire to avoid unnecessary escalation. Each defensive response from my family tested my composure, forcing me to remain grounded and precise even as emotions surged. The confrontation was not a single explosive moment, but a sustained process, a series of interactions that exposed the true character of those involved. I found myself increasingly detached, observing their attempts to manipulate the narrative while remaining committed to the factual account I had presented. By the night's end, the confrontation had achieved something remarkable. It had established boundaries, clarified expectations, and laid bare the contrast between action and inaction, care and indifference. My family had been forced to confront the reality of their choices, stripped from the protective layers of assumption and excuse. While the conversation did not resolve all tensions, it marked a definitive turning point. The pattern of avoidance and minimization that had dominated our relationships for years had been interrupted, and the undeniable proof of truth was now firmly recognized.
I lay back in the hospital bed, exhausted but resolute.
The confrontation had drained me emotionally, but it had also empowered me. For the first time, I felt that my voice mattered, that my experience could not be ignored, and that the truth, once documented and shared, carried weight beyond mere words. The confrontation was not the end of the journey, but it was a necessary escalation, a step that would lead inevitably toward consequences, accountability, and the eventual vindication that I had long suspected was overdue. The days following the confrontation felt like wading through a storm with no shore in sight. Though I had spoken the truth, documented the neglect, and enlisted witnesses, the emotional toll of the experience began to settle over me like a thick, suffocating fog. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation ebbed, leaving in its wake a quiet exhaustion that seeped into every thought, every breath. Each morning, I awoke to the sterile scent of the hospital and the rhythmic hum of machines. But instead of comfort, it now felt like a reminder of vulnerability, of dependence on others, and of how starkly absent my family had been when I needed them most. The exhilaration of vindication was overshadowed by a profound sense of isolation. Though Leah remained steadfast, her presence could not entirely shield me from the internal turmoil. The emptiness left by my family's absence gnawed at me relentlessly, each flash of memory amplifying the sense of betrayal. I found myself replaying small incidents from my childhood, moments when I had hoped for support or validation and had received indifference instead. The hospital's quiet corridors became a place of reflection and regret, where memories of unmet expectations collided with the raw, present reality of my current predicament. I questioned not only their absence, but the deeper implications of their choices, wondering if these patterns had always been a reflection of who they were rather than circumstantial missteps. The digital aftermath of the confrontation weighed heavily as well. The group chat, once a mundane channel of casual updates, had become a battlefield of words carefully chosen to obscure accountability. Each notification brought a pang of anxiety. The messages from Rachel and my parents were thinly veiled defenses, polite in tone, but devoid of real concern or empathy. They acknowledged receipt of the information, but skirted the real consequences of inaction. Every word seemed designed to placate without commitment, to respond without addressing the central truth. I felt the sting of exposure coupled with the frustration of their continued evasions. Even the staff began to notice the subtle changes in my mood. Nurses who had once smiled easily now observed me with quiet concern, checking in more frequently, asking pointed questions about my emotional state. Leah suggested gently that I speak with the hospital counselor, someone trained to help patients process emotional distress as well as physical recovery. Initially, I resisted, hesitant to layer my vulnerability onto strangers, but gradually I recognized that the emotional strain was real and demanding attention. The counselor helped me articulate the feelings of abandonment, anger, and sadness that had been simmering beneath the surface, giving them a safe outlet and framing them as a legitimate response to neglect. The isolation reached its peak during a night when the hospital corridors were silent. The lights dimmed, and the only sounds came from the distant beeping of machines and occasional footsteps. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of years of unmet support and broken trust settle on my chest. The confrontation with my family had liberated me in one sense, but had also crystallized the reality that the people who should have been my anchor were unreliable at best. It was a night filled with questions that had no easy answers. Why had they chosen convenience over care? Why had I been left to navigate a life-threatening situation largely alone? Could I ever reconcile this knowledge with the love I had once held for them? Despite the low point, small moments of support reminded me that I was not entirely without allies. Leah's quiet insistence on helping, the nurse's attentive care, and even the presence of other patients in the ward who shared brief moments of connection offered flickers of light in an otherwise oppressive darkness. These moments did not erase the hurt, but they highlighted a fundamental truth that support and care could come from unexpected sources. And the absence of family, while painful, was not the end of my world.
It was a lesson in resilience, though one learned through bitter necessity rather than choice. The lingering fatigue and emotional strain also manifested physically. Pain seemed sharper, recovery slower, as though my body had absorbed the psychological weight of the confrontation. Sleep was fitful, punctuated by vivid dreams where familiar faces, those of Rachel and my parents, loomed with judgment, indifference, or absent concern. I would wake with a racing heart, the hospital's fluorescent lights harsh against my vision, and a deep sense of vulnerability settling into my bones. Even minor setbacks in my recovery felt catastrophic, amplified by the emotional exhaustion I carried. Yet within this dark night of the soul, a seed of determination began to take root. I recognized that speaking the truth had consequences, yes, but that inaction and silence had consequences as well. The confrontation had shifted the dynamic from passive neglect to active recognition, and while the immediate aftermath was heavy, it marked the first step towards reclaiming agency in a situation where my family had abdicated responsibility. I understood that the next phase, facing the public or formal acknowledgement of the truth, would demand even greater courage, but it was a necessary step towards justice and validation.
By the fifth night in the hospital, I was exhausted in every sense, physically, emotionally, and mentally. But there was an undercurrent of clarity beneath the fatigue. I had reached the lowest point, a juncture where despair and resolve intertwined. The confrontation had stripped away illusions, exposed the truth, and laid bare the choices of those who should have cared most. The darkness was overwhelming, but it was also instructive. It forced me to recognize the value of support when it genuinely existed, the weight of neglect when it was withheld, and the importance of courage when facing uncomfortable truths. Though it was the darkest night yet, it set the stage for the final push, the point where truth would be tested publicly and accountability could no longer be deferred. By the morning of my discharge, the emotional weight of the past week had coalesced into something tangible, something that demanded an outward, public reckoning. The hospital had been both a sanctuary and a crucible, a place where my body healed, but where the fractures in my familial relationships were exposed in sharp relief. Leah had spent the night before organizing the logistics for my return home, arranging transportation, groceries, and temporary medical support. The home health aide assigned by the hospital was scheduled to arrive the morning after discharge, ensuring that my recovery would continue safely. But the preparations for physical recovery were now inseparably linked with the confrontation that was about to unfold. The truth that had simmered for days was ready to be tested in the presence of everyone who had either been complicit in or witness to my family's neglect. The first step of this public trial was literal. The hospital conference room, typically reserved for case reviews and discharge planning meetings, became the stage for a careful but unflinching confrontation. I arrived with Leah, carrying copies of the hospital records, screenshots of the family group chat, and notes from the social worker. The nurse who had overseen my care for the past days met us at the door, offering quiet encouragement. It was one thing for the truth to exist in messages and private conversations. It was another for it to be laid out formally, in writing, in a space where authority and protocol gave it undeniable weight. The conference room was stark and neutral, the fluorescent lights harsh, but exposing every corner, leaving nothing hidden. I began by presenting the sequence of events in chronological order. The ruptured appendix, the emergency post to the family chat, the lack of response, and the subsequent calls from the social worker were all laid out in a clear, factual narrative. Each piece of evidence was placed on the table, no emotion added beyond the bare acknowledgement of facts. The hospital staff observed quietly. Their presence lended credibility and an unspoken endorsement to the account. Leah's role as witness was crucial. She recounted the nights she had stayed by my side, the attention she had provided, and her repeated attempts to prompt my family to act. Together, our presentation made the previously abstract neglect concrete,
tangible, and undeniable. The initial reactions from my family were predictably defensive. Rachel attempted to minimize her absence by claiming she had not fully grasped the severity of the situation. My parents tried to frame their non-involvement as circumstantial, emphasizing other obligations and responsibilities. But the formal setting and the presence of hospital staff made these defenses increasingly ineffective. The social worker, a calm but firm authority, occasionally interjected to clarify timelines and confirm calls and messages. Each time she did, the narrative's credibility shifted further away from excuses and toward irrefutable fact. The contrast between intention and action, between verbal defense and documented reality, became impossible for my family to obscure. During the confrontation, I felt a mixture of emotions. Anger, of course, at the indifference I had endured, relief because the truth was being acknowledged formally, and a cautious sense of empowerment because I was finally reclaiming the narrative that had long been dominated by avoidance and neglect. Every question, every clarifying statement, every acknowledgement of receipt of records reinforced that the truth had shifted from private knowledge to a shared, validated reality. For the first time, it felt as though I was being heard not only by my family, but by impartial witnesses whose judgment carried real weight. The final moments of the conference were the most significant. My family was compelled to confront not only the factual reality of their absence, but the impact it had on me emotionally and physically. While their acknowledgement was not always verbalized as remorse, their body language and the formal record of events indicated a recognition that avoidance had consequences. The hospital staff closed the session with recommendations for continued support, both medical and emotional, ensuring that my recovery would not be compromised further. In that room, I felt a sense of closure that had been impossible in private messages or phone calls. The confrontation had been elevated to an official arena, leaving no space for denial or deflection.
As we left the hospital, Leah and I reflected quietly on the significance of what had occurred. The confrontation had been exhaustive, emotionally draining, and difficult to navigate, but it had achieved its purpose. The truth had been publicly validated, accountability had been formally recognized, and the dynamics of neglect could no longer remain hidden. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of forward momentum. The trial of truth was complete, and with it came the opportunity to rebuild, to recover, and to move toward a future in which boundaries were respected and support, whether from family or chosen allies, was no longer taken for granted. The final push had been successful not because my family changed immediately, but because the truth had been laid bare, undeniable and irreversible. And that realization, bitter and exhausting though it was, offered a clarity and strength I had never experienced before. I had survived the emergency, endured neglect, confronted accountability, and emerged ready to reclaim not just my physical health, but my emotional autonomy and the authority to define my own life. The days following the formal confrontation in the hospital marked a profound shift in my world, a subtle but undeniable reordering of priorities, relationships, and self-perception. While my body continued to recover, under the careful attention of the home health aide and Leah's steadfast support, my mind gradually absorbed the consequences of the confrontation. The undeniable proof of neglect and the formal recognition of the truth had not instantly transformed my family into attentive, empathetic caregivers, but the reality of their choices had been cemented in a way that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. The equilibrium that emerged was not one of reconciliation, at least not immediately, but one of clarity and justice, a new framework in which boundaries were clearly defined, accountability was established, and my own voice carried authority where it had once been diminished. The first indication of change was subtle but significant. My family began to communicate with a different tone in subsequent interactions. While apologies remained minimal, the pattern of dismissive or absent responses shifted toward a hesitant acknowledgement of responsibility. When Rachel sent a message asking for updates on my recovery, it lacked the previous casual indifference. It was tentative,
careful and filtered through the awareness that her prior actions had been documented and observed. My parents, too, adjusted their engagement. While their attempts at involvement remained inconsistent, there was a discernible effort to demonstrate care within boundaries that respected my autonomy and the support system I had established outside of them. The shift was not immediate or complete, but it was enough to signal that truth and accountability had tangible effects. Leah remained a central figure in this new equilibrium, her role evolving from immediate caregiver to ongoing supporter and advocate. She helped navigate the practicalities of recovery, from medication schedules to meal preparation, while also reinforcing the emotional strength I had discovered through the confrontation. Her presence underscored an essential lesson I had learned. Family was not solely defined by blood, but by consistent care and commitment. This realization reshaped my perception of relationships entirely, forcing me to reevaluate whom I trusted, whom I could rely on, and how I allocated emotional energy. The new equilibrium was not simply about my family recognizing fault. It was about me reclaiming the power to define my own support network. Professionally, the validation of my experience had ripple effects. Colleagues and friends who had previously been peripheral witnesses to my family dynamics responded with a mixture of surprise and support once the truth was known. Conversations that might have once been avoided due to discomfort or embarrassment now took on a tone of recognition and understanding. I found myself discussing the importance of advocacy, documentation, and personal boundaries more openly, realizing that my experience had value beyond the immediate crisis. The formal acknowledgement in the hospital and the corroboration by witnesses lent credibility to my narrative, transforming what had been an intensely private ordeal into a story that could educate and empower others facing similar circumstances. One of the most tangible outcomes of this resolution was the establishment of clear boundaries with my family. I no longer waited silently for help or validation. Instead, I explicitly defined the type and level of involvement I required. Requests for support were framed within the reality of their previous absence and my current recovery needs. This clarity reduced ambiguity and stress, creating a predictable framework for interactions that previously had been fraught with tension, uncertainty, and disappointment. The new equilibrium, then, was as much about emotional self-governance as it was about external recognition of truth. I had reclaimed authority over my life, not through vengeance or conflict, but through clarity, documentation, and strategic confrontation. Even emotionally, there was a sense of liberation that accompanied this new equilibrium. The exhaustion and turmoil that had dominated the dark night of the soul gradually gave way to a steadier, more resilient mindset. I began to recognize the limits of forgiveness in the boundaries of accountability. I learned to celebrate the support I had received, particularly from Leah, while no longer carrying the weight of unmet expectations from those who had proven unreliable. Each small victory, managing a medication schedule independently, completing a physical therapy exercise, or receiving acknowledgement from staff and friends, reinforced the sense that I was moving forward on my own terms. The home, once a place of anxiety and uncertainty, became a controlled environment where recovery was prioritized and emotional stability was supported. The hospital-issued guidelines and Leah's vigilant care merged seamlessly with the routines I established for myself. Meal planning, rest schedules, medication adherence, and gentle exercise became daily rituals that grounded me in both body and mind. Within this structure, I discovered a renewed sense of competence and autonomy. The trauma of neglect and confrontation was not erased, but it was framed within a context of action, resilience, and self-determination. By the end of the second week post-discharge, the broader implications of the confrontation were fully evident. The documentation and formal acknowledgement of truth had produced consequences that extended beyond immediate interactions. My family's awareness of being observed, their recognition of documented neglect, and the presence of impartial witnesses had shifted dynamics in subtle but enduring ways. While genuine reconciliation would require ongoing effort, the groundwork for accountability, respect, and measured involvement had been established. The new equilibrium was not simply a return to normalcy, but a redefinition of normalcy based on truth, evidence, and self-assertion. In essence, justice and vindication were realized not through punishment or revenge, but through exposure, clarity, and validation. I had navigated a landscape of neglect, confrontation, and emotional upheaval, emerging with the knowledge that my voice mattered, that truth could not be erased, and that self-advocacy was a powerful tool for creating sustainable change. The equilibrium I reached was less about reconciliation with those who failed me, and more about reconciliation with myself, an acceptance of reality, a recognition of personal strength, and a commitment to maintain boundaries that honored my needs and protected my well-being. Weeks turned into months, and in the quiet rhythm of recovery, I began to notice subtle but profound changes within myself that signaled the completion of a journey I had only just begun to understand. The physical scars from surgery were fading, replaced by a sense of vitality that was almost exhilarating after weeks of vulnerability and dependence. But it was the internal transformation, the reclamation of voice, agency, and emotional clarity that defined the true aftermath of the ordeal. Where once I had felt powerless, silenced, and subject to the indifference of those who should have cared most, I now recognized a strength that was entirely self-authored. This strength did not arise from confrontation alone. It was the culmination of perseverance, documentation, advocacy, and the unflinching commitment to speak the truth even when it was uncomfortable, unwelcome, or resisted. Leah remained a constant companion, though her role shifted from immediate caregiver to confidant, collaborator, and witness to my ongoing growth. She had been a lifeline during the crisis, but now she became a symbol of what it meant to have chosen family, those who act with unwavering integrity and care. Together, we organized routines that balanced physical recovery with emotional and intellectual engagement, morning walks to rebuild stamina, carefully measured meals that nurtured both body and mind, and quiet evenings spent reflecting on the lessons embedded in the recent ordeal. The structure provided by these routines was not rigid or punitive. It was a framework for empowerment, a daily affirmation that I could maintain control over my life and well-being. Perhaps the most striking evidence of transformation was the shift in how I viewed my family. The pain and betrayal of neglect had been real, yet I no longer carried it as a weight that defined my present or dictated my emotional responses. Instead, I recognized their limitations, documented in the hospital records and confirmed by witnesses, without allowing them to diminish my sense of self-worth. Boundaries were firmly established, expectations clarified, and interactions carefully managed. The lessons I learned were not simply about accountability. They were about liberation. I was no longer bound by the assumption that my well-being depended on the attentiveness or approval of those who had repeatedly failed to act. My security, both emotional and physical, was now self-determined. This newfound clarity extended beyond my personal relationships. Professionally and socially, I began to engage the world differently, drawing strength from the knowledge that truth, when articulated and supported by evidence, could command recognition and respect. I shared my experience selectively, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a testament to resilience and advocacy in situations where neglect or indifference might otherwise remain hidden. A symbolic moment of transformation occurred on a quiet afternoon when I returned to a park near my home, a place I had frequented before the emergency. The sun filtered through the trees in slanting golden beams, and the sounds of children laughing and dogs barking filled the air. I realized, almost with astonishment, that I felt fully present, unburdened by fear or lingering resentment. The shadow of past neglect no longer dictated my emotional state. I could observe the world with clarity, gratitude, and a quiet joy that had been absent for far too long. The park, ordinary in its simplicity, became a metaphor for my transformation, a place where light and clarity had returned, where I could navigate freely, and where growth and healing were visible in every breath and movement. Empowerment manifested not only in perception, but in action. I became more deliberate in choices regarding my health, relationships, and daily routines. I took ownership of my medical follow-ups, proactively consulted professionals, and reinforced the habits that supported both mental and physical well-being. Leah continued to serve as a supportive partner in these efforts, a witness to my self-determination and a living reminder that care could be reliable, consistent, and nurturing.
In parallel, I began volunteering time to advocate for others navigating medical emergencies or family neglect, channeling my experience into constructive action that amplified the lessons I had learned. The act of giving back became a tangible extension of my transformation, a purposeful use of hardship to generate hope, insight, and support for others.
Emotionally, I had achieved a balance I had long thought impossible. Where once confrontation and advocacy had felt like battles fraught with dread and uncertainty, they now represented tools of empowerment. Speaking truth no longer carried the paralyzing weight of fear. Instead, it was an instrument of agency, allowing me to navigate challenges, protect boundaries, and assert needs without apology or hesitation. The scars of betrayal remained, yes, but they were contextualized as reminders of endurance and growth, rather than sources of shame or resentment. Each interaction with my family, whether minimal or engaged, now occurred within a framework of clarity, accountability, and self-respect. In the final analysis, the journey from emergency to confrontation, from lowest point to public acknowledgement, had culminated in a transformation both subtle and profound. I was no longer merely a survivor of neglect. I was an empowered individual capable of navigating adversity with clarity, purpose, and resilience. The hospital, the confrontation, and the subsequent advocacy had provided tools, evidence, and lessons that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, shaping the way I approached life, relationships, and personal well-being.